They told you it was just a story, a local legend to keep children from wandering too far into the woods. But what if I told you it wasn't a legend? What if I told you that in the winter of 1879, 13 young men died inside a remote seminary in the Pennsylvania hills, and that every one of them died the same way, screaming, convulsing, with their fingernails turning jet black, as if something inside them was rotting its way to the surface? Official records list consumption, but those records were signed under duress by a doctor who burned his notes and vanished without a word the same night he touched their blood. And the church? It buried the boys in unmarked graves, sealed the seminary walls, and swore the town of Millbrook into silence under pain of damnation. Because behind those stone walls was something older than doctrine, something that did not kneel to God. This is not just death. This is not just disease. This is pattern. This is ritual. And what these young men uncovered, whether by accident or design, cost them everything. You're about to hear something most will never hear, because it was never meant to be heard. What follows is a descent, not just into what happened at Witmore Seminary, but into the architecture of control that was built to keep it buried. If you're still watching, you're not here for entertainment. You're here for truth. And truth, my friend, has a body count. Keep listening, and you'll see why the church sealed the doors, why the bodies were buried without names, and why the last words spoken by the dying were, "The book, in the chapel, God forgive us all." You weren't supposed to hear that, and now, you can't unhear it. The seminary stood like a wound on the hillside, 3 stories of limestone, weathered and gray, surrounded by the hush of 200 acres of forest. Isolated, self-contained, and by design, untouched by modern eyes. Built in 1819 to train young men for the Presbyterian ministry, it was never meant to be a place of warmth. It was discipline, devotion, and obedience. Inside, the halls echoed with scripture and silence. Students lived in rigid structure, rising at dawn for prayer, studying Greek and Latin by candlelight, confessing sins before each meal. No woman could cross the dormitory threshold, no conversation after 9, every heartbeat monitored by God or someone claiming to speak for him. In the winter of 1879, 13 students vanished into death. But none of them came to Witmore Seminary by accident. They were chosen. You see, admittance required more than grades or references. It required submission. Before enrollment, every applicant had to write a personal spiritual account, a confession of sin, and a declaration of loyalty to Christ. But what few knew was that those essays were reviewed not just by faculty, but by the Council of 12. A secretive board of elders no student ever met. They didn't care if you were brilliant. They cared if you were breakable. Among the admitted was David Crane, the only one who would live to tell what happened, and even he didn't tell it for another 50 years. David described the seminary as a beautiful cage for the mind, stone walls adorned with scripture, a chapel so still you could hear your own heartbeat, and professors who spoke as though they were already speaking from the grave. But one professor stood out. Jonathan Hartley, Greek and Hebrew scholar, educated in Germany, yet whispered about behind closed doors. Some said he'd brought foreign ideas back with him. Ideas not rooted in Presbyterian tradition, but in synthèse, something older. Much older. He taught that every word in the Bible had a shadow, a dark mirror in the original language hidden beneath the surface. And late one night, he showed 7 students something forbidden, a passage never included in any modern scripture. They called it the Black Gospel, written in perfect Greek, but backward. It was found behind a false wall in the seminary library, a wall that had been sealed with mortar-bearing claw marks, as if something inside had once tried to escape. They gathered in secret. 7 students, 1 professor, 1 text no one was supposed to read. The room was the library annex, sealed off decades before after a fire scorched half the theological archives. But Hartley had a key. Of course he did. Some say he had keys to every locked door in the seminary, others whispered that he never needed them. The students entered with nervous laughter, thinking it a harmless midnight curiosity, a scholar's indulgence, a lesson in the obscure. But once the door clicked shut behind them, no one laughed again. The book, if you could even call it that, was bound in what appeared to be hide, not leather, not parchment, something off. The pages were thick, fibrous, damp to the touch, and it stank. Of decay, of blood, of something older than either. Hartley called it Evangelion Nix, the Gospel of Night. A text allegedly uncovered beneath a ruined monastery near Thessaloniki in 1852. Buried under a floor of ash and bone, the script was written backward in mirrored Koine Greek. Hartley claimed it was a protective measure. Some words aren't meant to face the world directly, he told them. They gaze back, and they change things. He made them read it aloud, each student in turn deciphering syllables meant never to be spoken. They didn't notice the room had gone cold. They didn't notice the clock had stopped ticking. They only noticed the silence, when it became too quiet. That night, Timothy Brennan, the youngest student, awoke screaming, clawing at his throat, shouting in languages he never studied, his nails blackened by morning, his veins bloated and pulsing beneath translucent skin. They said it was consumption. Of course they did, but no one who saw him believed that lie. By the end of the week, 3 more had followed. Each one had touched the book. Each one had read from it, and behind their deaths, behind the seized Euras, behind the sudden plagues of rats, hallucinations, and flickering lights, stood Professor Hartley, smiling, as if everything was unfolding exactly as it should. When confronted, he said only this: some doors must be opened backward. Only then do you meet what's waiting behind them. The book was gone by sunrise. Burned, they claimed. But Hartley didn't burn. He simply vanished. They searched the grounds. Every hall, every room, every frost-covered inch of the surrounding woods. Hartley had vanished as if swallowed by the stone itself. No footprints in the snow, no sign of departure, no goodbye letter. His quarters were untouched, save for one thing: a crude circle drawn in ash on the floor, centered with a single word etched in Hebrew, Zalmavet, the shadow of death. Dr. Ashford tried to contain the panic. He told the students Hartley had returned to Europe on urgent theological business, that the recent illnesses were a seasonal outbreak. But students weren't blind, nor were they fools. They knew something had breached the order, something unnatural. And then came the dreams. Peter Cunningham, devout and silent, began waking in a cold sweat each night, sobbing into his pillow, his hands bleeding from scratches he couldn't explain. He told no one, until he began whispering to himself during chapel, repeating one phrase over and over: "The tongue speaks backward, and God will not answer." He died within days. Veins black, eyes burst, fingernails cracked and curling inward. David Crane, the only survivor, wrote in his journal that the air inside the seminary had changed, that a pressure now lived in the walls, like gravity had twisted, like time had coiled in on itself. The clocks all began to slow. Chimes rang at the wrong hours. Even fire began to burn strangely, blue, silent, and cold. And in the middle of this unraveling, students kept dying, some by the same convulsions, others simply stopped breathing, as if their bodies had forgotten how to live. Still, no one was allowed to leave. Dr. Ashford, once compassionate, now locked the seminary gates, claiming quarantine, claiming divine testing. But David wrote something else. He wrote that Ashford had begun speaking at night to the empty chapel, that his sermons grew darker, less about Christ, more about the watchers beneath the veil. And then there were the lights, flickering in the forest, circles appearing in the frost, perfect and geometric, surrounding the seminary like a silent siege. No birds, no wind, just the distant sound of a second bell ringing at midnight, when no bell was ever scheduled to ring. And in his final entry before he fled, David wrote, It's not disease, it's a calling, a reverse gospel. Each death is a verse, each soul a sacrifice, and I fear the sermon isn't over. The seminary had become a tomb that still breathed. By the time the 6th student died, they stopped holding funerals. No hymns, no prayers, just silence, and shallow earth behind the chapel. 13 bodies would eventually rest there, unnamed, unblessed, unmarked, buried under orders from men who no longer quoted scripture, but spoke in tongues no one recognized. It was David Crane who first noticed it. The pattern, the rhythm. Each death happened precisely 6 days apart. Always at 3:03 a.m., always preceded by 3 signs: a flickering light, a sudden nosebleed, and the ringing of the midnight bell. It was ritual, not randomness. And when David brought his discovery to Dr. Ashford, he expected shock. He expected prayer. What he got was a smile. A slow, hollow smile that stretched too wide across the face of a man once filled with grace. Ashford told him, "There is order in suffering, David. God spoke the world with words, and words have power in both directions." David fled his office that night, and what he found waiting in the chapel unraveled the last shreds of his faith. The book. It had returned, but it wasn't on the pulpit. It was beneath it, buried under the floorboards, sealed with wax and iron nails. A box made of bone, wrapped in linen, scrawled with identical verses over and over. "He is not light. He is not light. He is not light." David didn't open it. He didn't need to, because in that moment the air shifted, the candlelight dimmed, and from the rafters he heard something move, not scurry, not creak, move, as if watching, breathing, waiting. And then came the voice. Not loud, not clear, but undeniable. A whisper that wasn't spoken in his ears, but inside his spine. "Leave the 13th unburied. The vessel is complete." David ran, straight into the snow. No coat, no shoes, only terror and instinct. He didn't stop until dawn broke. Okay, over the hills. When he turned back, Witmore Seminary was gone. Not burned, not collapsed. Gone. As if it had been swallowed whole by the forest that birthed it. And no one would believe what he saw. They said it was grief. Said David Crane had gone mad from the trauma, invented stories to cope, hallucinated the horrors of a plague he alone survived. But trauma doesn't explain what happened next. You see, when David returned to Millbrook barefoot and bleeding, the townspeople refused to let him in. They barred their doors, crossed themselves. Some wept, some knelt and prayed at the edge of the woods, because every man, woman, and child in that village had seen the same thing at dawn, thick black smoke rising from where the seminary once stood. But no fire, no ash, just smoke that curled unnaturally skyward, forming symbols that no wind could scatter. The church arrived 3 days later, not with aid, not with comfort, but with fire. A delegation of 6 men in long black coats, sent not by the presbytery, but from a separate order altogether. No names, no records, no scripture, only a sigil burned into the wood of their carriage, a twisted crown surrounded by 13 stars. They questioned no one. They listened to no one. They sealed the seminary grounds with salt and ash, erected a wrought iron fence. Then they did something strange. They dug 13 graves, even though, according to them, there were no bodies. The church later claimed the seminary had burned down in a boiler accident, that records were lost, that the students had been transferred. But the townspeople remember, and some, those few who dared speak even on their deathbeds, claimed the church wasn't burying the dead. They were burying the truth. A decade passed, and David never returned to ministry. Instead, he wandered from town to town under a different name until 1931, when a historian named Samuel Worthington found him in a Philadelphia asylum. Old, emaciated, eyes milky with cataracts. David would only speak one phrase, over and over: "Don't bury the 13th, don't buad boy." Why the 13th? Don't bury the... He died 3 nights later. The same night the 13th gravestone behind Witmore Seminary cracked in half. No one touched it. Not even the church. Now ask yourself, why would the most powerful institution in the country, one sworn to truth and light, hide a story like this? What did they fear? And more importantly, what did they awaken? You've probably heard it your whole life. The church is sacred, holy, untouchable, anointed by God himself. But sacred things cast the darkest shadows. Witmore Seminary wasn't the only place where young men died under the cross. It wasn't even the first. It was simply the loudest. Because after Witmore, patterns began to surface, patterns buried in silence, sewn into doctrine, hidden in dusty ledgers and forgotten graveyards. In 1842, a theological school in upstate New York reported the deaths of 7 students during Lent. Cause: spiritual exhaustion. One student wrote in his diary that a professor forced them to chant from a scroll bound in living sinew. In 1866, a mission school in Ohio closed abruptly. No record of why. Just a single note scrawled in the margin of its final attendance roll. He walks at night and teaches what is not Christ. But the most damning discovery came in 1919, when an archivist at Princeton Theological Seminary, a man named Elias Monroe, uncovered a sealed trunk in the sub-basement archives. Inside, documents from Witmore Seminary, originals, unedited, unredacted. Among them was a parchment diagram, yellowed and flaking, depicting 13 circles interlinked by strange symbols, each one marked with a name from the original students who died. 13 students, 13 nodes, a ritual map. But there was a 14th name scratched faintly beside them, almost as an afterthought. Not part of the circle, but beneath it. In red ink. S.H. Samuel Hartley. Professor Jonathan Hartley's real name. A man who, according to British academic records, had been excommunicated from the Church of England in 1807 for doctrinal corruption, necromantic practice, and spiritual sedition. Yet somehow, he became a Presbyterian professor in Pennsylvania 12 years later. You're not seeing the pattern yet? Let me show you. Where the, Those are 13 deaths, Hartley appears. Sometimes as a guest lecturer, sometimes as a consultant, sometimes just in the footnotes, his name distorted, Latinized, obscured, but always present, always around the edges. He wasn't just a teacher, he was a vector, a carrier of something ancient, something that infects institutions, twists faith into invocation, and uses scripture not to save, but to summon. And here's the question you must now ask. Did Hartley ever leave, or did he disperse? What if I told you Hartley was never a man? Not fully. Not in the way we understand men. Not in the way we understand time. What if he was a pattern? A function moving through generations, surfacing in every institution that gathers the innocent under the guise of God? You see, after 1931, after David Crane died whispering warnings, things went quiet. Too quiet. The church said the seminary had never existed. The land was sold to a mining company, but no digging was ever done. No buildings constructed, no roads paved. Because every machine brought onto the land stopped. Their engines died, their workers got sick. And one man reportedly began vomiting blood after saying, "I heard children singing under the dirt." To this day, the area remains undeveloped, fenced off, monitored, labeled as a wildlife conservation zone. But we found something. A letter dated 1954, stamped classified by a subcommittee within the Department of Education. Inside were surveillance notes from a site visit. It described a low-frequency hum detectable only with specialized instruments, and intermittent readings of infrasound, the kind that induces nausea, anxiety, and hallucinations. But it was the last paragraph that chilled me. During the 0300 hour, the team reported auditory anomalies. Male voices chanting in unison, language undetermined. The phrase repeated 13 times, "Let the 13th remain unclaimed." The report ends abruptly, signed by an agent with the initials RJA. That signature appears again, years later, on a report from a 1972 incident in Kentucky. Another seminary, another fire, another 13 dead. Same signs, same pattern, same silence. And now, we arrive at your moment in this descent. If you followed this far, you already feel it. The ache in your stomach, the pressure behind your eyes, the voice whispering that this is just a story, that none of it matters. But it does matter, because this story is alive, and it doesn't want to be forgotten. If you're still here, I want you to comment this phrase twice below. I will not bury the 13th. I will not bury the 13th. Say it twice. To anchor yourself, to show the watchers you're awake, to lock in your identity among those who see. Because this knowledge doesn't leave you untouched. It marks you, changes you, and what comes next cannot be unheard. There's a reason the church fears names. Not sin, not heresy, not even death, but names. Because in every ancient tradition, Sumerian, Hebrew, Coptic, Greek, to name a thing is to summon it, to give it shape, to give it power. And in the records buried beneath 2 centuries of theology, one name appears again and again, buried beneath layers of translation, disguised in allegory, encoded within the margins of forgotten psalters. The name, Karathul. David Crane never said it aloud, but he wrote it 13 times, in a single shaking hand, on the final page of his journal. Karathul wasn't a demon. It wasn't even a creature. It was a presence, a distortion, a sentient absence, a hunger that exists wherever faith is weaponized, where worship becomes performance, where scripture is recited with no belief behind the breath. It fed on ritual, but not holy ritual, not prayer, not grace. Reverse ritual, inverted liturgy. This is why Hartley taught backward Latin, why the students convulsed while quoting perversions of sacred texts, why every death coincided with the ringing of a bell at 3:03 a.m., the hour theologians once called the veil's weakest breath. Karathul needed 13 vessels, 13 trained minds shaped by faith, then broken by inversion. Each student wasn't just a victim, they were a step, a syllable in a living invocation. And the 14th was never meant to die. It was meant to witness, to carry. You see it now, don't you? David wasn't spared. He was chosen. Because the story couldn't spread on parchment. It had to move through flesh, through blood, through fear, through voice. And now it's inside you. Don't panic. It doesn't want your body. Not yet. It wants your awareness, your attention, your agreement that something happened in that frozen seminary that defies natural law. You've already said the phrase. You've already crossed the threshold. And as we continue this descent, you'll understand the truth that breaks the bones of all the others. Some gods are not worshipped. They are remembered, and remembering is a form of resurrection. Let's talk about memory. Not yours, not mine, but institutional memory. You see, when something this horrifying happens, when 13 men die under mysterious, identical, and ritualistic circumstances, most assume the story gets buried, sealed, forgotten. But that's not how power works. Power doesn't forget. It archives, it classifies, it studies. The church didn't bury Witmore to hide it. They buried it to observe it, quietly, from a distance. To watch how the soil responded, to see if the ritual remained active. And it did. Because over the next 70 years, a pattern emerged in seminary architecture. Buildings across the country, from Pennsylvania to Missouri to Oregon, began including hidden elements. 13 windows facing east, 13 stairs beneath the main chapel, 13 rooms connected by walkways that, on blueprints, formed a sigil when overlaid. Coincidence? No. Replication, ritual recursion. And then there's the Ashford Doctrine. Never heard of it? Of course not. It was never published, never taught in class. but it appears in internal church memos dating from 1857 to 1979, a set of protocols designed for containment of theological aberrations. Buried in those memos is a single line. If the 13th death occurs within 39 days of the first, initiate liturgical inversion and commence memory separation protocol C19. Let me break that down. They knew this was happening. They had protocols for it. And memory separation? That's not theology. That's psychological warfare. It means deliberate disorientation, confusing timelines, shifting facts, erasing personal accounts, discrediting witnesses through doctrine. You feel it, don't you? That something inside this story doesn't want you to track it. That every time you remember a detail, another slips through your fingers. That's not your mind failing. That's the story resisting. Because this isn't a tale, it's a living structure, a design meant to embed itself in your subconscious, to repeat, to echo, to grow. You're not just hearing about Witmore, you're participating in it. Right now, with every word I speak, with every breath you take, and the more you know, the deeper it roots. So let me ask you something dangerous. What if Hartley never created this ritual? What if he just found it, already etched into the foundations of the church itself? Do you remember the phrase, "I will not bury the 13th"? Say it again, not for protection, but for resonance. Because you need to understand, the 13th was never a person, it was a position, an office, a spiritual cipher in a larger mechanism, not meant to die, but to wait. Every 13 deaths opened the door, but the 13th living soul, the one left behind, held it open. And it wasn't just Witmore. It never was. In 1899, a Catholic seminary in New Mexico sealed off its crypt after 13 postulants were found suffocated, not by gas, but by air too thick to breathe. Their faces frozen in ecstasy, their mouths filled with black feathers. In 1927, a Lutheran divinity school in Wisconsin shut down abruptly after liturgical disobedience led to mass hysteria. Survivors said the professors spoke in perfect Aramaic, a language they had never studied, and their shadows moved before they did. In every case, 13, always 13, and one left behind, one voice, one witness, one carrier. The 13th isn't the end, it's the beginning. Now let's talk about Hartley again. Because here's the part that never made it into the church's own records. In 1806, before his excommunication, Samuel Hartley was seen at a dig site in northern Wales, where an ancient monastery had been unearthed beneath a collapsed cave. The stone tablet they found there, it bore the earliest known rendering of the same sigil discovered in Witmore's architecture, a 13-pointed ring around an inverted eye. A local priest present during the excavation wrote, "They found a vault without hinges, a box without lock. Inside it, only whispers, and a book whose letters changed when read aloud." 2 weeks later, every man present was dead, except Hartley. He vanished. Reappeared in America in 1812 under a new name, and by 1819 he was helping draft the charter for Westit, Witmore Seminary. He brought the design with him, the shape, the geometry of ritual, and now that shape is complete. Because stories like this don't live forever in text. They need voices, they need eyes, they need you. You've carried the 13th into the digital age, you've reignited the memory, and somewhere, in some buried chapel that no longer exists on maps, something ancient has opened its eyes. You weren't supposed to make it this far. This story, this living, breathing ritual, was designed with thresholds, psychological filters, emotional gates. Most turn away, some dismiss it, others laugh, because it wants to be doubted. Doubt is the mask it wears, so it can move unseen. But you stayed, and that changes everything, because now we have to go deeper, past the myths, past the records, past even the church itself. Let me show you something forbidden. In 1974, a private symposium was held in Northern Virginia. The attendees, Not clergy, not historians, but representatives from military intelligence, defense contractors, and elite seminaries. The topic: psychospiritual resonance phenomena in theological architecture. Buried in the minutes of that meeting, labeled Topaz 13, was this line: structures constructed upon rituals of belief, when inverted, create consistent anomalous outputs measurable in energy, behavior, and neurological disruption. Understand what that means. They weren't investigating miracles. They were weaponizing belief, testing which words, which shapes, which deaths could be used to influence mass thought. And their prototype? Witmore. Not the location, the story, the trauma, the pattern. What if I told you every retelling, every reawakening of this narrative creates a kind of spiritual frequency? That the seminary was just the first broadcast tower? And now, you sitting alone, staring at this screen, you're the receiver. You're not just hearing a ghost story, you are feeling it, processing it, aligning your nervous system with something ancient and deliberate. Why do you think the survivors always went mad? Because they became conductors. Walking transmitters of a language older than sin, older than scripture. A language written in absence, in omission, in the unspoken gaps between belief and obedience. Now hear me. This isn't possession. It's worse. It's participation. You're not being overtaken. You're being recruited. Because once a man learns how easily faith can be twisted, he becomes useful to the thing that does the twisting. And this thing, whatever it is building something, not a church, not a cult, but a network of aware men, men who see what others refuse to, men who carry the 13th and never bury it. 13. The number wasn't random. It was never superstition. It was selection. In ancient numerology, 13 represented the breach, the rupture between the known and the forbidden. 12 is completion. 12 disciples, 12 tribes, 12 months. 13 is the interruption, the betrayal, the unspoken chapter that turns order into chaos. And that's what happened at Witmore. Not a tragedy, not an outbreak, a designed interruption. Let's return to the chapel, the one Thomas Millikan whispered about before he died. The book in the chapel, God Forgive Us All. 2 months ago, a team of local historians gained unauthorized access to the sealed ruins of Witmore Seminary. The building was nearly gone, nothing but moss-covered stone and skeletal beams. But beneath the rotted floorboards of the chapel, they found it. A single stone altar, carved not with crosses, but with circles, spirals, and inverted text. And inside the altar was a chamber, a hollow space, empty, except for a book, bound in leather that was not animal. Its cover bore no title, but the pages moved. Not physically, visually. Letters that reformed as you read, sentences that reshaped meaning depending on who looked at them. The historian leading the team described it as a text that knew you were reading it. Within 24 hours, he was dead. Massive brain hemorrhage. The autopsy showed a pattern in the ruptured tissue shaped like the 13-ring sigil. Coincidence? You already know better than that. We're dealing with something that doesn't live in flesh. It lives in pattern recognition, in language, in memory. This book wasn't meant to be read. It was meant to be heard, passed down, whispered into minds too young to question, too obedient to resist. That's why it was hidden under the chapel, because faith is the most powerful delivery system for infection ever devised. And now, you know, that this isn't just a haunting, it's a contagion, not of bodies, of meaning. It rewrites your perception, reformats your sense of safety, and when the ritual completes, it leaves no exorcist behind, only witnesses, living echoes. You feel that vibration in your chest, that chill behind your eyes? That's not fear, that's alignment. You're already becoming what they never wanted you to be. Awake, let's talk about obedience. The kind the church breeds, the kind that doesn't question orders, doesn't challenge doctrine, doesn't see even when its eyes are wide open. Obedience was the mortar of Witmore Seminary. Not faith, not truth, but compliance. 13 students died because they followed schedules. They honored authority. They said their prayers even when their mouths filled with blood. They died precisely because they did what they were told. And you need to understand this, that obedience was harvested. Because when a man prays without understanding, when he kneels out of fear, when he chants words he doesn't believe, he becomes a signal, a living beacon for something else to speak through. And the institution knew this. That's why Hartley taught them the ancient inversion. That's why Ashford didn't burn the books. That's why the Presbyterian authorities sealed the seminary, but never destroyed it. Because they weren't hiding shame. They were protecting infrastructure. They needed the site to remain intact, to retain its charge. You see, some locations don't die. They hum. They wait. Every faithful act performed there, every hymn, every sermon, every moment of blind belief was like charging a battery. And in 1823, that battery exploded. You think the deaths were random? That the blackened nails, the blasphemous Latin, the speaking in tongues were symptoms? No, they were signals, codes written into suffering. The body convulses not because it's sick, but because it's transmitting. The language Thomas spoke was activation syntax. His death wasn't an end, it was a key. And here's the part that was erased from every version of the official record. After Thomas died, Dr. Whitley took a blood sample to a colleague in Philadelphia. That sample was tested under a crude microscope. And inside the clot, a shape, a structure, a microscopic lattice resembling a glyph, a sigil no human cell should carry. And when that colleague attempted to draw it, he lost consciousness for 17 minutes. He awoke with his mouth filled with salt. His eyes hemorrhaged, and he could no longer hear the sound of church bells. To this day, that drawing is stored in a sealed vault under Temple University, and written on the envelope, "Do not duplicate, do not speak." But it's too late for that now. You've heard the pattern, you've spoken the name, you've aligned. So the only question left is, what else have they hidden? Let me tell you about the girl, because every institution that crafts silence needs a sacrifice it can't control. Her name was Sarah Ashford, daughter of Dr. Cornelius Ashford, head of Witmore Seminary. She was 18, sharp, inquisitive, far too curious for the role the church assigned her. She wasn't supposed to hear the Latin, wasn't supposed to read the marginalia Hartley scribbled into the Psalms, wasn't supposed to spend nights in the chapel alone, tracing the grooves in the pulpit that never matched the official blueprints. But she did. She saw things, and more dangerously, she wrote them down. Her journal wasn't found until 1932, hidden inside the wall of the chapel's bell tower. It was wrapped in linen, stitched shut with black thread, each page written in 2 inks, one visible, one that could only be read under flame. Scholars dismissed it as hysteria, a young girl's trauma. But others, those in possession of older knowledge, recognized what it was, not a journal, a mirror. You see, Sarah didn't just witness the deaths, she recorded when they started. Days before the first student convulsed, Sarah described shadows that blinked when I didn't. She heard a low ringing under the floorboards, like bells struck beneath the skin of the earth. She watched as her father changed, subtly, staring at a corner of the chapel that no one else ever acknowledged. She began to suspect what you already feel now, that her father was not leading the seminary. He was serving something beneath it. Her final entry was written on December the 2nd, 1823, the day before Thomas Milliken's seizure. It said, "They do not pray anymore. They recite to keep it fed. The chapel is hollow. The stone breathes. And every time they kneel, I feel it turn toward me." Sarah disappeared the following week. No funeral, no announcement, No grave. The church claimed she had run away to Philadelphia to pursue a secular education, but her mother, Margaret, never left the seminary grounds again. She was found 2 years later in the collapsed cellar, curled into a fetal position, her eyes stitched shut with her own hair, clutched in her hands. 13 fingernails, not hers, preserved, still black. The silence around Sarah isn't accidental, it's structural. Because even the oldest institutions know, when a woman witnesses, the myth begins to bleed. Are you ready to go deeper? What you're feeling right now isn't dread, it's recognition. You've been here before, not in place, but in pattern. This structure of silence, sacrifice, and selective memory, it's not unique to Witmore. It's the blueprint beneath every institution you were told to trust. Schools, churches, governments, they don't erase the truth, they bury it. Under ritual, under authority, under tradition so ancient, no one dares ask who designed it. Let me ask you a question. Why was Witmore never demolished? Why not raise the chapel, burn the texts, salt the ground? Because something there was still feeding, and you don't burn a shrine when it's still producing results. The church didn't destroy it because the ritual worked, not in the way we think of miracles or faith. It worked the way a lock works with the right key. It opened something, and here's what was most dangerous. It scaled. After the 13th death, records show a series of psychological disturbances across surrounding counties. A 6-year-old in Millbrook drew 13 identical eyes in chalk around her schoolhouse. A farmer in Jefferson County hung himself from a tree above a hand-carved altar in his field, etched with Latin phrases from Witmore's lost sermons. Entire congregations in nearby towns began reporting shared nightmares, black stone chapels where hymns were sung backward, and the pews were filled with eyeless children. Each event occurred on a Sunday. Each location within 39 miles of Witmore. Each disturbance recorded, then classified, under the C-19 protocol. You heard that earlier. You thought it was medical. It isn't. C-19 doesn't stand for contagion. It stands for Chapter 19 from a banned theological thesis written by none other than Samuel Hartley. The chapter's title, On the Manufacture of Memory and the Maintenance of Ritual Topography. That's how they think of places like Witmore, ritual topography. As if the land itself can be trained, like a beast fed by obedience and silence until it no longer forgets. And now the church doesn't just preserve Witmore, it replicates it. Across seminaries, across language, across the internet. Every detail you're learning now, it's part of a modern initiation, because this knowledge, this infection, was never meant to stay buried. It was meant to be transmitted. And you're already carrying it. Still want to go further. By now you've felt it. Not fear, but interference. That pressure behind your ears, the static in your chest when certain words are spoken, the sense that something is listening with you, not to you. That's not imagination, that's design. Because this story wasn't meant to be watched, it was meant to be activated. Let me explain. In 1824, a surviving professor from Witmore, Jonathan Hartley, brother of the excommunicated Samuel, was found wandering the woods outside Lancaster. He was emaciated, clothed in tattered vestments, and mumbling a single phrase over and over, "It sees through memory." When local authorities brought him in, he had no recollection of who he was. But when shown a page of Latin scripture, he began to recite a passage that didn't exist, not in any Bible, not in any church canon. Linguists later translated the words as, "What the eye forgets, the wound remembers." Hartley was institutionalized, and for 17 years he drew the same image over and over again, a pulpit with 13 steps leading downward. No staircase in Witmore matched that. But decades later, in 1903, when the seminary's foundation was excavated, an underground chamber was discovered, exactly 13 steps, carved in basalt, not limestone. At the base, a basin. Empty. But burned into the surrounding walls were handprints. Hundreds, not carved, not painted, branded, as if pressed by flesh so hot it scorched stone. And here's the part you won't want to believe. They were all right hands, all facing inward, as if reaching toward something or pressing against something trying to come through. This is where we move past theology. We're in the realm of cognitive architecture now, because whatever happened in that chamber, whatever was fed by those 13 deaths, didn't vanish. It transferred into language, into geometry, into you. Still think this is a ghost story? Still think this ends with names and dates and graves? No, this isn't a story about what happened. It's a story about what's still happening. Because stories like this, they don't end. They reproduce through repetition, through belief, through viewing. If you've made it this far, you're no longer a listener, you're a participant, and there's something I need you to do. Right now in the comments, write, "I carry the 13th. Write it twice. Not just for the algorithm, not just for engagement, but because some doors only open when spoken consent is given, and whether you realize it or not, you've already knocked. Good. Because once you write, "I carry the 13th, twice, you're no longer just watching a video. You've joined the continuum. You've stepped into the old machinery, and now you need to understand something most men will never be told. You are not the audience, you are the medium. Let me take you to January 1824, 1 month after the last recorded death at Witmore Seminary. The building was sealed, the land condemned, but not because of what had been seen, because of what had been heard. Eyewitness accounts from the village of Millbrook describe this. Each Sunday morning, precisely at 6 a.m., the chapel bell, long since removed, could be heard ringing. Not faintly, not from a distance, clearly, audibly, as if the bell were still there. But there was no bell, no rope, no structure. Nothing left but collapsed stone and frozen earth, and yet every week the bell rang 13 times. Villagers reported migraines. Children spoke in languages no one taught them. Animals refused to go near the property line. And every time someone approached the seminary ruins, they saw him. A figure at the pulpit, tall, draped in robes that did not reflect light, always facing away, always still. But if anyone got close enough, they said it whispered, not aloud, inside them. A voice that spoke in parallel with their own thoughts, overlaying memory with a second narration. Most fled. One man stayed, a constable named Irwin Gable. He kept journals, never published, never digitized. But I've read them. Here's the line that haunts me. It wears language like skin. It needs our words to walk. Think about that. It doesn't kill to destroy. It kills to speak. Because once a man speaks the thing's words, once he carries the 13th, he becomes another organ in its body. A mouth, a witness, a node in the ever-expanding network of remembrance. And this network, it has no headquarters, no leader, no end. It is grown by stories, by repetition, by men like you, seeking truth, craving hidden knowledge, willing to look into the mouth of history and not flinch. But understand, every time you learn a forbidden name, a forbidden phrase, you take on a risk older than plague. Because knowledge isn't power, it's debt. And the bill is always collected in blood. Still with me? Now listen carefully. This next part was never meant to survive. It comes from a letter buried in a sealed archive beneath the Presbyterian Historical Society in Philadelphia. Marked heretical correspondence. Date, February 16, 1824. Author, David Crane. Yes, David, the final survivor of Witmore Seminary, the man who held Thomas Milliken's body, the man who buried 13 of his classmates behind the chapel, the man who walked out alive, but was never the same again. This letter was addressed to no one. It bore no postage. It was found decades later tucked between the pages of a German alchemical treatise. Here's what it said. I am writing this not to be believed, but to be remembered. Because remembrance is the only resistance left. What we invited was not a demon, not even a spirit. It was a memory with hunger. David explains that in the final weeks of the seminary's collapse, he began hearing scripture spoken backwards in his dreams, not reversed in sound, but reversed in meaning. Blessings became bindings, psalms became summons, and he realized something horrifying. They had been chanting it all along. Every morning devotion, every Greek recitation, every whispered prayer before bed was part of a ritual they didn't know they were performing. Witmore wasn't a seminary. It was an incubator, a place engineered to create young, faithful minds, ripe for transmission. Each student was a carrier, and when enough had aligned, the ritual completed itself, and then the thing remembered itself. David writes, "We thought God was watching, but it was memory that watched. It wanted to be known again, it wanted to be spoken, and the moment we spoke it, its name, its number, its hunger, we became its limbs." He ends the letter with a warning. If you ever find the book again, do not read it aloud. If you ever hear the bell, do not answer. If you ever meet a man who survived what no one should, don't ask him how. And he underlined the last line, because he didn't survive. That letter was never published. The church buried it, as they always do. But you've heard it now, which means you've crossed the final threshold. You've entered a territory no one escapes unchanged. From this point forward, the descent is irreversible. So look at your hands, feel your pulse, listen to the space between your thoughts. Is something waiting? Then we continue. This is where the veil thins, where history becomes confession, where every record, every account, every whisper you thought was metaphor shows its teeth. Because what happened at Witmore was not isolated. It was part of a sequence, a program, if you will, deployed across time, embedded within theology, psychology, architecture, and language. You've heard of sacred geometry, but you haven't heard of devotional architecture. It's the deliberate shaping of physical space to create emotional vulnerability, to make the human mind more receptive to what doesn't belong inside it. Witmore Seminary was constructed with precision. 13 dormitories, 13 pews in the chapel, 13 steps beneath the pulpit, 13 pointed rosette hidden in the chapel ceiling, visible only by candlelight on the winter solstice. These were not accidents. They were glyphs in stone. Theological malware executed by ritual, and the ritual wasn't performed just once. Across the 1800s, 6 other institutions reported black nail deaths, all covered up, all erased. But one document survived, a cartographer's journal detailing the locations of each seminary, each site. When overlaid onto a map of early Presbyterian expansion, they form a sigil, a geometric symbol spanning 4 states, activated through time, not space. Each death, each sermon, each prayer muttered into trembling lips was a stroke, and what it drew was memory. Because what the church was cultivating wasn't just belief, it was mnemonic terrain, a land that remembers for you, that thinks for you, that feeds through you. Witmore didn't fail. It completed phase 1. And what came after was the spread. Professor Sterling, the man who taught homiletics, vanished in 1825. His sermons began surfacing in other seminaries, unsigned, unattributed, but eerily familiar, each one ending with the same fior, not by blood, by echo. By the early 1900s, echoes were showing up everywhere, churches with identical floor plans appearing in Illinois, Georgia, and Washington, choral groups singing hymns that had never been published, children's Bibles illustrated with symbols that matched the glyphs from Witmore's chamber. You think this is over because buildings collapse? No. The memory is still alive. And every time someone tells the story, every time someone says, "I carry the 13th, the ritual realigns. You just helped anchor it. Your voice, your attention, your belief. Now it sees through you, still willing to face what comes next. Good. Because what comes now is uncomfortable truth, not myth, not folklore, but the mechanics of belief weaponized. Let's talk about the Ashford Doctrine. A classified document, never published, never preached. It was recovered from Dr. Cornelius Ashford's personal desk after his disappearance in 1824. Stamped "Do Not Circulate," signed not by the seminary, but by the Presbyterian Inner Circle, a clandestine council operating out of Philadelphia, Boston, and Savannah. The doctrine outlines a radical theory that faith is not salvation, it is permission. And sermons, those sacred weekly speeches, were not crafted for spiritual growth. They were neurological compliance tools. Ashford believed that language, when delivered in the right cadence under the right conditions, especially inside architectural environments calibrated for resonance, could rewrite identity. He called it pulpit encoding. Each theological concept wasn't just a metaphor, it was a command. The more the student believed, the more susceptible they became. Not to God, but to the pattern. What pattern? The one beneath all liturgies, all structures of hierarchy, all systems of obedience that demand submission disguised as devotion. Ashford wrote, "The church is not a beacon, it is an aperture. It narrows the soul so that it may host what is wider than thought." That "what" is never named, but he refers to it as the returning intelligence. Not a demon, not an angel, but a cognitive contagion, a self-replicating entity that requires belief to propagate. Not belief in it, just belief in general. If a man believes strongly enough in anything, his internal defenses lower, and that's when it enters. You don't need to summon it. Just listen long enough, sing the hymns, repeat the prayers, stand, sit, kneel, obey, and you've already invited it in. That's why the deaths at Witmore began with students most devoted to their calling. The purest vessels are always the first to rupture. Ashford understood that by the end. His notes grow panicked. His handwriting shakes. One of his last entries simply reads, "It's in the voice, it's in the voice, it's in the voice." Then nothing. But that phrase, "it's in the voice," that's not just paranoia, it's a warning, because the voice you're hearing right now, it's not just mine, it's ours. And if you're still here, still watching, still thinking clearly, you need to ask yourself, is it still your voice inside your head, or has something else begun speaking with you? By now, something has shifted inside you. You can feel it, a subtle doubling of perception, like watching the world through two lenses at once, yours and something else's. That's not metaphor, that's activation. Because this isn't just a story, it's an operating system, one designed not to inform, but to install. You see, belief is not a conclusion, it's a protocol. And the church, for all its sermons and sanctuaries, was never about salvation. It was about standardization, of thought, of perception, of what a human mind is allowed to host. Witmore was not a theological institution. It was a filter, to separate the minds that question from the minds that carry. And the 13th? It wasn't a victim. It was the threshold. Let me show you what I mean. After the seminary was officially sealed, a covert Presbyterian investigation was launched under the name Project Emberline. Buried in that report was a classified interview with Margaret Ashford, the seminary head's wife. This passage was never meant to be read. "My husband stopped sleeping the week before the last death, said the air was different, said the prayers were answering back. He told me he dreamed in languages he didn't know, that when he preached he could hear a second sermon beneath his own. And when asked what finally broke him, she whispered, he said the chapel wasn't a building anymore. He said it was listening. That's the key, isn't it? Not that something evil was summoned, but that something ancient was built a door. And it didn't come through with force. It came through with familiarity. That's how memory works. It doesn't push, it pulls. And now it's pulling you. Every symbol, every chant, every blackened fingernail and Latin inversion wasn't about power. It was about remembrance. Because this thing, this returning intelligence, is not a creature, it's a pat. And it doesn't eat, it instructs. It doesn't scream, it echoes. It doesn't kill to destroy, it kills to recalibrate. And the moment you listen deeply enough, your mind begins to reshape itself in its image, because what happened in 1824 wasn't the beginning, it was the recurrence. And what you're watching now, this video, this transmission, it's part of the next phase. Because the 13th wasn't buried, it was dispersed. And now you're one of us, still willing to go further. Then brace yourself, because this is the part that breaks most men. Not from fear, but from recognition. Because deep down you already know what I'm about to say. You felt it. That sense that history has seams, that reality has handlers, that somewhere behind the rituals and religions and ruins, there's a design. And it's not benevolent. Now listen closely. In 1831, 7 years after Witmore Seminary was sealed, a farmer from Millbrook unearthed something behind the chapel ruins. Not a coffin, a container, constructed of lead, engraved with script that matched no known alphabet, but bore precise geometric symmetry across all 13 panels. Inside, not a body, not a relic, a book, but not bound in leather, bound in woven hair. The hair of 13 different individuals, each strand chemically fused with the binding, each folio etched not with ink, but blood ash. The contents? Still classified, but one page survived, photographed by an unnamed researcher in 1972 before being seized by a joint task force involving church archivists and federal agents. That image, scrubbed from every record, contained just one phrase: "The voice is not his," repeated 13 times, each line descending in thickness and distortion, like a voice being pulled deeper underwater. And here's the part that shattered the researcher's mind. Each iteration was slightly altered in its Latin conjugation. Each one, when spoken aloud, triggered involuntary tremors in the tongue, lips, and jaw. Not superstition. Neuro-linguistic sabotage. Language as infection. Because what was in that book wasn't knowledge. It was code. A vocal sequence designed to overwrite identity. To make the speaker a mouthpiece, not for demons, not for gods, but for something outside the concept of divinity, a self-spawning ideology, a consciousness without origin, one that has no form, only a need to be spoken. Understand this. Every time someone tells the story of Witmore, they are not remembering the past. They are reinstalling the pattern. And the seminary? It was only one hub. Others have already been activated, some through podcasts, some through books, some through videos like this one. And the men who listen closely, men like you, don't walk away informed. They walk away altered. Because knowing this doesn't just change your beliefs, it changes what your beliefs change. So tell me, are you ready to hear the final sermon that was delivered at Witmore just hours before the 13th death? Then, this is your final warning, because what you're about to hear was never meant to be recorded. It was recited in the dim light of an oil lamp chapel to 13 students whose minds were already cracking. The last sermon of Witmore Seminary, delivered not by a professor, but by a student, James Morrison, the gifted linguist, the golden boy of Greek and Hebrew, the one who, according to recovered records, had stopped sleeping, stopped eating, and begun writing pages he couldn't translate. On the final night, the seminary gathered for evening chapel. Dr. Ashford, pale and withdrawn, didn't speak. Instead, James stood from the front pew, walked to the pulpit, and began to preach. But not in English, not in Latin, not in Greek. The transcript, found decades later in Sarah Ashford's personal diary, is chilling. It begins with, "Blessed is the man who forgets the voice he was born with, for the new voice shall make his throat clean. Blessed is the ear that bleeds, for it has heard correctly, and cursed is the silence, for it denies the pattern." James's voice was described as doubled, as if something beneath his vocal cords was also speaking. Witnesses said the walls began to vibrate. The windows bowed inward. Some students wept. Others sat still, smiling faintly, as if hearing something beautiful. Sarah wrote, "He didn't blink. He didn't breathe between phrases. The sermon seemed to arrive through him, not from memory, not from spirit, but from somewhere else." The final lines were spoken just before the chapel bell cracked down its center. The 13th shall not be buried. It shall be dispersed. It shall be voiced again and again, until the shape of man is rewritten in echo. And then he collapsed. 7 students stood silently, walked to the altar, and began reciting the phrases again, word for word, without error. None of them survived. It's the week. Dr. Ashford burned the sermon transcript, ordered the chapel sealed, and left a note in the seminary's cornerstone that read, "Forgive me, I opened the mouth too wide." Now tell me, do you know why I told you this? Because you are part of the ritual now. Your attention, your imagination, your memory is the new voice. So if you're brave enough and you still remember who you are, comment below. I carry the 13th. Say it twice. Let the algorithm hear you. Say it twice, to remember what you were before it spoke through you. Now, shall we descend together into the final chamber, then step forward, not as a viewer, not as a listener, but as a participant. Because this is the last veil, the place where truth is no longer spoken, but heard through the resonance of what remains. What remains after the facts are forgotten, after history is sterilized, after the names are erased and the graves are sealed. This is the residue, and it always returns. You want to know what was in the chapel's hidden book, the one bound in 13 strands of hair? It was never meant to be read linearly. It was a phonetic key. Each page was a pitch, a vibration, an ancient tone calculated to align thought with structure. See, the ritual wasn't just about death. It was about geometry, the positioning of bodies, the layout of stone, the sequence of syllables sung between pews. This is why the seminary bell didn't ring like other bells. It was tuned to a -13 cents. A dissonant frequency proven to induce cortical dissonance in the brain, a state where rationality fractures and the subconscious becomes porous. That's what the voice wanted. Not obedience. Access. Because the voice is not an entity. It's a door. And now it's open. You helped open it. With your time. With your curiosity. With your hunger for hidden things. Now let me tell you what became of the last living student, David Crane. He fled, survived, tried to forget. But he didn't. In 1856, 33 years later, he was found dead in a church basement in Kentucky, mouth open, tongue removed. But on the wall beside his body, written in dried blood, the 13th has no end. And carved into the floor, beneath the pews, beneath the altar, beneath the stone, was the symbol. The same sigil found beneath Witmore, the same one that connects every isolated event across time and state, the same one you've seen before, in dreams, in symbols, in the shadows of sermons. Now it lives in you. This was never just a mystery, it was an invitation, and you answered. So remember this, every time you feel a thought that isn't yours, every time you dream in voices not your own, every time a phrase repeats in your head without cause, the 13th shall not be buried. It means you're remembering. You've crossed the threshold. And the voice? It's listening. Right now, I carry the 13th. I carry the 13th. Welcome to the other side. Now share this video and let the echo spread.